Presentation will be recorded for you guys. If you want to reference it later, I'll go ahead and send a follow-up to all the people who registered for the program today, and send some additional invasive species information and links. So before we get started, just a couple housekeeping rules. I prefer if you guys keep your mics off, put questions in the chat. I won't be able to answer them in real time, but I'll be able to answer them after the end of this presentation, and I'll be on until everybody has their questions filled or answered. In this talk, so a little bit about myself. I'm the UF-IFAS Extension Florida Sea Grant Agent in Collier County. What does that mean? I work for the Extension Service over here in Collier County by the fairgrounds. The Sea Grant program does a lot of education and outreach for marine programming, enhancing opportunities for economic for businesses in the marine areas, conserving resources, and a lot of my work I do is with sustainable fishing programs or invasive species. So today in this talk, we're going to talk about non-native species in the invasion process. You might have heard about them in the news a bunch, but there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So in this talk, we're going to go over terminology. What is an invasive species? We're going to go over the economic and environmental impacts that invasive species has on our economy and environment over here. We're going to go over how and why Florida is so special, some common invasive species characteristics, information about some common scaly fish profiles that you might see here, and then talk about the invasive fish roundup that we have coming up, which is a big event that is education focused and where we harvest a lot of non-native fish species in the area. So that is my buddy Colin actually with a peacock bass that we caught in a quarry around the Everglades area. So that's a really pretty and impressive fish and something that's non-native to our area, but is considered not invasive, but a game fish. So what is an invasive species? You might have heard the words like alien, foreign, non-indigenous, exotic, and some of them sound pretty fun and some of them sound pretty scary. So there's, a lot of terminology that's, pretty hard to navigate if you aren't really interacting with that every day or have a science background. But we have three species over here. We have a slow raccoon, an alligator, and a cat. Usually I ask folks, take a shot at what is an invasive species on this screen. But since I can't get too much feedback and interaction with you guys, the invasive species here is the cat. So an invasive species is a species that is from a it's outside of its specific geographic area, and it was introduced by humans intentionally or unintentionally, and does or can cause harm to the environment, economy, or humans. So without any one of those pieces of the definition, it might fall under another category. So if it's non-native, introduced by humans, and doesn't cause this kind of harm, it would just be a non-native animal, right? If it is native and it causes environmental, economic, or human harm, that might be on the individual basis. And that's something that you could consider maybe an alligator, a pelican, something like that, harassing you on the beach at the pier, potentially, becoming a health hazard. But they're native, so they're from here, and we're in their area. So invasive, non-native, introduced by humans, intentionally, unintentionally, and does and can cause harm to the economy, humans, or the environment. So a little bit more about the terminology. We have a lot of words up here. Talk about what a native is in a specific geographic area, non-native outside that geographic area. Introduced, that's somebody letting it go into the environment. An intentional introduction could be like biological control, introducing a different species to take care of another one that's a problem. Unintentional could be, somebody has a cage and then a hurricane comes and knocks it over, or the cage breaks, or ballast water, different kind of forms of introduction. Established, this is a really important definition because that's when it becomes either a real problem, right? So established is a self-sustaining reproducing population. So this is going to be a native or a non-native, but when it's non-native, that's when it becomes, they get their foothold into the environment and it's really hard to remove them. There hasn't been any successful eradication of any established reptile, amphibian, fish, in the state of Florida. So once they're here and they're reproducing, their negative impacts that they have on our environment and potentially the economy are sort of here to stay. We went over invasive and then we went over that nuisance. So a nuisance is pretty much something that would have invasive characteristics, but is a native kind of species and more of an annoyance maybe per individual basis. Think of, something sort of begging for food or could potentially be a hazard in your backyard like an alligator, but they're from here. So what are some invasive species? We hear all the time about reptiles, amphibians, a lot of the scaly kind of things, but they can be anything, right? They can be plants. Give you a clue, a lot of times an invasive species might have the country of origin in its name. So think of Brazilian pepper, or Australian pine. And, I sort of invite you to start thinking about when you see these different kind of invaders or when you see an invasive species or a non-native species in our environment, consider how it is invasive, right? So it has to potentially cause damage to the humans, economy, or environment. Without that, it's just a non-native, which is our landscaping, our pets, all sorts of stuff that could be little to no harm as long as it's maintained and kept properly. So Brazilian peppers are bad because they have something called allelopathy, which is like a chemical defense that they put underneath their understory. Same thing with Australian pines, where they kill everything underneath them, sort of makes a monospecies thicket. And in the case of Australian pines, they have a very shallow root bed that can make these trees fall over during windstorms, causing a lot of kind of erosion issues, all sorts of bad stuff. But invasive species could also be animals, right? So they could be like feral swine. These are now in 57, no, they're in 35 different states. There's about 6 million or more of them, and they cause $1.5 billion of agricultural damage every year to the United States economy. Not to mention that they disrupt environments by rooting around. They could be disease carriers, all sorts of bad stuff, right? We have reptiles, that you might have heard of the green iguana, Burmese python. Pretty much most of the lizards you see outside, if you live in South Florida, are probably non-native lizard species. We have about 3 or 4 times the amount of non-native lizard species found in the state of Florida than native lizard species. But like I mentioned, start thinking about how these are invasive. So with the case of the green iguana, what are they doing? They're potentially invasive because they can burrow underneath seawalls. They can eat native flora that other kind of critters rely on. And then they can, sort of be a nuisance for humans where people pay money to get trappers to remove them. But everything is sort of a black to white kind of gradient. Some things are definitely more invasive than others. Other things can be more on the non-native side where it's hard to figure out how they're negatively impacting us or the environment. We have cane toads. These are definitely an issue if you have pets in the South Florida area, dogs and cats that could potentially bite their poisonous parotid glands, and they're not used to that kind of poison. So that's definitely negatively impacting humans there by impacting our pets. We have fish. That is a marine fish there, the lionfish. We'll talk more about them and why that's sort of a good poster child for invasive species, causing damage to the economy, humans, and the environment. We have birds, these can be European starlings that are up north that were actually introduced by Shakespeare fans early on, or even Muscovy ducks. But like I mentioned, it's sort of that black to white kind of gray infrastructure. So Muscovy ducks are definitely a nuisance in some cases. Some cases they could be pets, but they can increase nutrient pollution to different kind of water bodies, harass people, and they're not really from here and they're pretty plentiful. But then, we want to think of other kind of things too, like pathogens, funguses, bacteria. They can really be anything. So this little guy I like to have as a good example. You might be walking past invasive species every day and not really even know it. Um, like cats, a cat in an environment is bad. A cat inside your home is perfectly fine, but outside they might take out the United States. I think there's estimates of 1 to 4 billion birds every year and 6 to 22 billion small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, right? So that little critter that you see walking past you every day is creating, maybe more of an impact than an iguana might. So this little guy, like I mentioned, you might walk past him, not even think twice, was actually introduced by a piece of citrus called a Buddha's hand, and that is the Asian psyllid. And the Asian psyllid was known to introduce the citrus greening disease that caused almost over $7.8 billion in economic damage, reduced the citrus industry greatly in the state of Florida, causing losses of thousands of jobs, a loss of revenue. So this little animal that, you might have not thought caused any sort of problems was a vector for a disease that nearly crippled an industry in Florida. So how and why? What a lot of invasions actually don't really take hold. And why is that? So first of all, by definition, invasive species aren't from here. They have to overcome a barrier, and that's usually a geographic location, right? So that they have to either get transported by boat, by plane, over a mountain ridge, over an ocean, all sorts of stuff, right? So somebody had to think it's cool or tasty to bring here. Usually they come from agriculture or the pet trade or ornamental kind of reasons like landscaping. They had to get transported here, right? Then somebody had to either intentionally or unintentionally let it go, right? So that's a barrier over there. Then they had to become established, which is that self-reproducing population, right? That's when they become a real problem. But if you are an alligator and you get let go in New York during the summertime, you're fine, right? But during the wintertime, too cold, probably going to die during that winter. So plenty of reasons why something doesn't become established, whether we don't have the right environmental conditions, we don't have the right food for it, water chemistry, rain cycles, even if there's not another kind of mate to mate with, right? So if there's only one of you, and you can't do fission like a plant, propagation cuts you up and stuff and reproduce, you're going to need to reproduce. So what are the chances of you running into another species such as yourself to become established and then spread? In the United States, there's about 50,000 non-native species that were introduced. Most pose little to no threat, but it is one of the leading causes of extinction, with about 300 out of the 13 or 1400 species on the endangered species list negatively impacted by invasive species in some degree. So, all these things that we're spending lots of money to save might be competing with non-native critters or plants or even diseases. So it's about $120 billion a year damage to the United States economy. But that's a little bit under recorded, right? Because a lot of this damage is recorded as, like I mentioned with the Asian psyllid, agriculture, because it's easy to calculate. You had this yield of this product, this disease came in, now you have less of that kind of product. Nice clean numbers. Same thing with forestry. The emerald ash borer was a bug that affects ash trees. Trees don't really move very fast, right? So if that beetle kills that tree, we can record, percent coverage. But how do we record, the value of a raccoon or biodiversity to our environment? And that's still to come, and some of the reasons why it might be harder to, calculate the impact of these non-native or invasive fish and reptiles, amphibians, and all sorts of kind of things. So about 98% of the U.S. food supply, worth over $800 billion, is non-native species. So we really need them to survive. And like I mentioned, most pose little to no threat. If they're maintained and cared for properly in captivity, it's just when you start letting them go, they can become a problem. So what are characteristics of invasive species? You might see these often between taxa that you encounter in the wild. So fast growth rates, being able to outcompete not native species, short time to reproduction, if you can reproduce within your first year, gives you a better foothold of, outcompeting our native species here. Lots of offspring are great parents, either having tons of eggs like these cane toads that could lay over 8,000 eggs per individual twice per year, or uh, being great parents. So guarding your babies, making larger eggs, giving them a really good start is a strategy that they have. Good at dispersing, if you can spread, maybe you could find all these little ecological niches that native species can't find, and you can really take over. Tolerant of many habitats or environments, that can help with spread, either, living through that transport mechanism, being able to be shipped, lived in ballast water. Maybe there's a freeze and you don't die, you just can, go dormant and reproduce when it gets warmer again. That's one characteristic. Good at using resources. Some of these invaders, like the lead tree down in the Keys, can basically grow out of like a piece of limestone. So if you could use not very nutrient-rich sources, same thing with like reptiles and amphibians and fish. For a lot of their metabolism isn't based on keeping warm, so they can use that energy to grow or make more of themselves. Cryptic coloration is a way that they can slip through, unprocessed shipping kind of materials, or even resist predation from native predators. Defenses and competition, like I mentioned, that Brazilian pepper had that allelopathy, that chemical warfare that they put out. But then other kind of species like the cane toad, they're definitely poisonous. Then we have the lionfish is definitely venomous as well too. And here are some pictures of mother of millions. That's a succulent that you can see at a lot of stores in the area, but each one of these little leaflets could potentially be another one of those plants, which they can live in our like dune kind of systems and sort of outcompete our native kind of plants in that area. Green mussels, these can be estuarine saltwater kind of species that are found over here. And those are tilapia nests that you see, but many other species of native fish make nests similar to these tilapia. So a couple more housekeeping kind of things until we get to some of the cool species profiles that we have here. So we want to talk about costs because oftentimes the person who is responsible for introducing these invasive species are not the ones who are paying for the damages that they create. Sometimes you can get economic and ecological costs and just sort of meld them together because we pay money for management, we pay money for research, which is definitely economic, definitely has a price tag to it. But then there's those ecological costs of predation. This lionfish is actually eating, a little yellowtail snapper. So that's a species that people pay a lot of money to go catch, or it's commercially very valuable and important for our state's economy. Disease transmission. We talked about, the feral hog potentially introducing diseases. The Burmese python is a carrier for a snake lungworm disease or a rat lungworm disease, a parasite that can negatively impact our native snake species, even if they don't like eat them, just being present in the environment. There could be competition. This is a old world climbing fern forest in Georgia, and you can see that there is not very much diversity there. It's not really supporting our native critters that might have needed that certain pollinator, that plant, that environment to grow. This is just choking out a forest and definitely bad. It costs money to maintain. It can disturb habitats, with disturbing different habitats, basically makes a clean slate, wipes out our native kind of critters and allows non-native critters or plants to really take hold. And then, like we mentioned before, what's the cost of the loss of biodiversity? And some indirect economic costs could be loss of revenue. In some cases, businesses have shut down because of invasive species like the brown tree snake in Guam, caused some power outages. And then restoration efforts. We spend a lot of money to restore natural habitats, bring endangered species back from the brink, and some of those can be meals for a non-native invader. So here we talk about, an area that's invaded in time. Pretty much it just shows that prevention is the cheapest and most effective management tool, followed by eradication, which is early detection, rapid response. If you have sightings of something that you don't really see too often, it really helps managers know where that is so they can send researchers down there to contain the problem before it becomes, that establishment, which once they're established, it's really hard to get rid of them and those management costs go up. So, Florida, why are we so special? We like it here and so do they. So we're definitely a tourism and trade hotspot. We have over 30 ports of entry. We have over 50 million visitors bringing in their favorite foods like that Buddha hand, pets, ideas, all sorts of stuff. We have a big ornamental and agricultural sector over here. We're growing plants from all over the world. We have We have over 1,300 miles of coastline, so lots of ways that things can either drift over, lots of little niches in the habitat that they can take over that's tropical and subtropical. We have some disturbances like hurricanes that can increase the chance of something getting knocked over and escaping. We have lots of disturbed habitats from development. These gated communities will just clear cut a forest, push out our native species, create really shallow bodies of water retention ponds with streetlights all over the place that, are pretty much cane toad heaven. There's, a lot of evidence that shows that by having a natural kind of a habitat that we're creating better homes for our native kind of critters and plants. And also some other cool kind of stats. 85% of non-native plants that enter in through the United States come in through Florida. 88% of U.S. flower imports come in through Florida. 55% of fruits and vegetables that come in through the U.S. come in through Florida. And we have over 1,400 non-native plants in our environment. So if that specific bug needs a plant pollinator, chances are we have it, right? All those imports increase the chances of something just sliding in undetected. And it's about a $500 million a year problem for our state, with about $50 million just being aquatic weed control alone. So it gives you a scale of, some of those things that you might not even think of as being invasive. You might walk past it every day because it's just a green plant, could be causing really negative impacts to waterways, natural areas, all sorts of things. Give you an example of like the scale of the problem, like I mentioned. We have about 43 established non-native lizard species and 16 native, so almost 3 times the amount of non-native lizard species in our environment. 4 established non-native snakes, 46 snake species, and then 4 established non-native frogs. All toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So think of cane toad, Cuban tree frog, African greenhouse frog, some other ones. So we'll go over some species profiles of some critters that you might have seen in the area or you have some questions about. We're going to go over mostly fish because this was in association with our invasive fish roundup that we have. So first up, we have the red lionfish. It's not a freshwater fish that qualifies for a roundup, but something that is definitely in the news. You might have seen it on some restaurant menus. You might have actually eaten it yourself or harvested it yourself. So these are part of the Scorpionidae family, and there's over 500 members of the Scorpionidae family. So this is a very diverse group of fish. There's 3 genuses of lionfish. There's Pterois, like pterodactyl, Dendrochirus, and Bachypterus. Pterois volitans, or the red lionfish, is the one that's most common in our area, and you can see that invaded range right here in the red. They're also in the Mediterranean, and in that green, that's sort of where they're actually from. There's also Pterois miles, which is another form of lionfish that's very similar to the volitans, but about only 2% of the population that we see over here, a very small percentage of that. These were first observed in 1985. They're introduced by the aquarium trade. Like I mentioned, a lot of these invaders are here because we either wanted to eat them or look at them. Ornamental, aquarium trade, or for food. A big one would be about 3.7 pounds. It seems like every lionfish roundup they break the record. They eat fish and invertebrates. Their feeding habitat, their feeding method is using their big pectoral fins. Pterois, like I mentioned, it means actually winged in Greek, I believe, which it's like pterodactyl. So they have these big corralling pectoral fins, and they just basically corner something and gulp it down really quick. And that could be invertebrate, it could be a fish, all sorts of things important to the reef, or could be important further down the line, being caught on hook and line. So these fish lay about 15 to 30,000 eggs in 2 gelatinous egg masses. They're small eggs, they're pelagic. They can spawn almost weekly in warm water kind of environments, like maybe down in the Caribbean, as long as they have food. They could be reproducing within their first year of life and live in depths of over 1,000 feet and handle temperatures as low as 50 degrees and salinities as low as 4 parts per thousand. So that's 4 grams per liter. That's about like 1/9 of what regular full strength salinity is. So they're very hardy, and that's why they've really taken hold, because they could be transported. They could live in a not very great fish tank, and somebody might dump them. So just another aside, that 1985 time was before Hurricane before Hurricane Andrew, which a lot of people think introduced these fish. They definitely were there before that time, but by giving more of these critters in the population, that's reducing that bottleneck of just uh, them reproducing with each other, lowering the genetic diversity, maybe introducing diseases internally to themselves. So the more genetic diversity, the more introductions that you have, maybe the more robust that population is. So there might have not been hundreds of introductions. It might have been, maybe dozens that have caused them to, really blow up like that. So they might all be slightly related to some extent, or, we could figure that out with genetics in the future. But so they're invasive because they cause damage to the environment by consuming reef grazing species, to the economy by eating species that we might pay money for later on, or anticipate being in a seafood menu in the future, and then negatively impacting humans by being venomous. So they have 18 venomous spines. They're located on the dorsal fin, the pelvic fin over here, and the anal fin over there, not these pectoral or the caudal fin. Okay. Oh, so next up we have the peacock bass. So this is a fish that is sort of controversial on, whether you call it invasive or non-native. There's a little bit of lag, but these fish, they're the butterfly peacock bass. This is actually a cichlid, not a bass itself. So cichlids, they're a very diverse family of fish. I think there's about 1,400 or more different species of cichlid out there. There's about 15 to 17 different species of peacock bass. Like I mentioned, this is a butterfly peacock bass, or Cichla ocellaris. And usually if you see ocellaris, that means it has a dot on it, like an eye spot. I'll tell you why it's hard to put a number on exactly, that's 15 to 17 different species, in a little bit. But their native range is the Amazon River Basin in South America, first observed in Florida by 1984. They're introduced by FWC as a biological control mechanism in hopes of removing spotted tilapia. That is another non-native fish that was really ubiquitous on East Coast canals that you see out there. So these fish, were introduced to take care of that spotted tilapia population. They grow very fast, actually. The first year of life, they could get about 12 to 14 inches, and then a 17-inch fish is about 3 pounds, and 19-inch fish is about 5 pounds. They spawn in April and September, with peak spawning in noon. They're substrate spawners, so they lay their eggs on like a rock kind of area, and then the male and female will guard them. So this time of year, you might be able to get one to bite your hook just based on aggression guarding its eggs. So they eat mostly fish. They hunt and ambush. They live in freshwater bodies, and they are non-native, not invasive. So remember, invasive is causing damage to the environment, economy, or humans. These are considered a game fish. Yeah. But in this little map over here, this is from the EdMaps website, or the I've Got One, a web app that you could see. And it's a really cool way to see where an invasive species might be. You could search by, plant, animal, all sorts of different stuff, and look by pinpoints or counties highlighted. So this is all the places that they've been documented in the state of Florida. And to give you an example of why it's hard to know how many species there are of peacock bass to begin with, is they can look very different. So let me go ahead and click. Okay, so that is one I actually hooked in his nuptial kind of hump that they developed during spawning season with a little jig that I had. The males will develop that little hump on their head. We have an individual there and an individual there, and I caught both of those fish without moving my feet. So you can see the diversity just within one water body of these fish, right? And then those are juvenile peacock bass. So if you're in the heart of the Amazon and you're trying to analyze which fish that you're getting, genetic tools are going to help us out in the future greatly. But right now it's hard to make on these visual kind of cues. But the biggest one out there is the tremensis, Cichla tremensis, I believe. So next up, we have Mayan cichlids. So these are sometimes called atomic sunfish. They are very fun to catch. Unfortunately, they're in our environment. They were introduced by the pet trade because if you've ever seen them before, they're very fluorescent. The males will get these very juiced up kind of colors, looking like a sunset with teal stripes going down. They look prettier when they're in the water. When they get out of the water, they sort of fade just a tiny bit. They're introduced by the pet trade, get about 15 inches, 2.5 pounds. They eat shrimp, small fish, snails, insects, and some plant matter. They are euryhaline, which is a fancy term for being able to withstand wide ranges of salinity. So, this one could potentially be underneath mangroves and sort of a fresh input kind of area, freshwater input kind of area, which allows them to maybe travel over places that some of these other species that really need specifically fresh water to live, these guys can handle that mixy kind of environment. And then these are nest builders. They spawn in April and June, substrate spawners, which means they lay their eggs on a piece of rock or something. Usually that means if you're laying your eggs on a piece of matter instead of just broadcasting them into the water column, that usually means a bigger egg, which means a bigger baby, which means a better chance of surviving. And a lot of times these substrate spawners will really guard that substrate that maybe some native species of fish don't really do, which gives these guys a better chance of, outcompeting stuff. They're great food quality. I've eaten them a few times and, it's hard to tell that they're not snapper. Interesting thing about cichlids is that there's no native cichlids in Florida. There's only one native cichlid in the United States, and that's the Rio Grande cichlids. But now cichlid family is the most diverse family of fishes in the Everglades. Um, so just to give you an idea of the problem there. These fish will actually have one nostril on each side of their head. Cichlids do. The centrarchids, which would be your sunfish, your largemouth bass, those kind of fish will actually have two nostrils on each side of their head. That's a little fun fact there. That is one I caught on fly and a fun way to target these fish. So next up we have Oscars. So these fish are also from Central South America, from the Orinoco kind of river basin. They were first observed in 1960s, introduced by the pet trade. If you go to Petco or PetSmart right now, you'll find a bunch of them about this size, and they look very similar to that. You see that ocellatus? Remember I said like ocellaris means eye spot? They got that little spot on the tail right there. So they get about 2 to 3 pounds, about 12 inches. They are big, small fish and insect eaters and crustacean eaters. You find them primarily in like the 41 canals and 75 canals, and now people are actually targeting them more than some other native species of fish. They're great fights. Only thing about them is they're pretty slimy and they have these really sharp dorsal spines on top, so watch out when you're handling them. They can spawn, they're substrate spawners again, big eggs, big babies, laying them on a piece of, material. And they can lay about 3,000 eggs when temps reach 82 to 91 degrees. So, in a lot of Florida, that could be year round. So it gives you the idea of them really uh, just proliferating down here in our area, Southwest Florida or South Florida. A big one, like I mentioned, is about 2 to 3 pounds, 12 inches, and they are of great sporting quality for people who like to target panfish. That is one I caught in the Everglades on that similar kind of lure that you saw that hooked the peacock bass. And it's these little guys that I get from Walmart. Great little lure. Sometimes I'll tip them with night crawler, and if I jig it, I'll get a fish that's more aggressive, like a peacock bass or regular largemouth bass. And if I let it sit on the bottom with that little bit of night crawler, I'll catch probably Mayan cichlids, Oscars, walking catfish, all those kind of critters. Okay, so then we have tilapia. So a lot of people will be like, "Oh yeah, I've had tilapia," but what species of tilapia? Tilapia is a generic term for a cichlid from the Middle East and Africa. There's definitely African cichlids out there. Not all cichlids from Africa are tilapia, but a lot of these ones that you see originate from that area. So there's a 6 established or potentially established species in Florida. We have the black chin tilapia that could handle almost the full strength salinity. You can find them underneath the mangroves out there. There's a spotted tilapia, which the peacock bass was introduced for. We still have spotted tilapia out there, but these are ones that accept a hook a little bit more if you have like a fleshy kind of bait. There are blue tilapia, there are Nile tilapia that look very similar and oftentimes they hybridize. There's the Mozambique tilapia, the hornet tilapia, and like the red belly tilapia, I believe. There's 3 different genuses, the Oreochromis, Cerotherodon, and tilapia. The Cerotherodons, the males will actually hold the fry in their mouth, right? The Oreochromis, the females will hold the fry in their mouth, and the tilapia genus, they're actually substrate spawners. So really good at, providing young care for their young, which gives them a head start, allows them to outcompete different critters, right? So, why are these invasive, right? If they eat algae, detritus, plankton, that's really low on the food web. That's not really preying upon, our native critters out there. Well, by eating low on the food system, there's plenty of food available for them. They can have a lot of biomass, sort of disrupt food webs in that area, that aspect. They can root around, sort of disrupt native species from spawning potentially. Just taking up space really. And if you go to the springs of North Florida, you'll see tilapia everywhere. You'll see them in golf course ponds. They're really ubiquitous in our environment. Some of them are euryhaline, like I mentioned. Euryhaline, that's fancy word of it being able to tolerate many salinities, like that black chin tilapia that I mentioned, which gives you an idea of them just potentially expanding their range, right? If a storm surge comes and you won't die because of that change in salinity, now you have a little highway to go to different kind of bodies of water out there. And like I mentioned, they're great parents. Okay, so you guys might have seen these a lot. If you are aquarium people, you might have had one in your aquarium. These sometimes are called sucker mouse catfish or sailfin catfish or armored catfish. So these are in the Loricariidae family. There's 3 species of sailfin catfish in Florida. There's the vermiculated, the Amazon, and the Orinoco. So the vermiculated is the most common, and that is the one on uh, the left, I believe. The Amazon is the one on the right. And then the Orinoco is that one on the bottom. They look very similar. It's really hard to tell them apart unless you're looking on the bottom side of them. They're introduced from the Amazon River Basin, from the pet trade. Like I mentioned, they're really common in aquaria, but when you see them in aquariums, they're about this big. Well, what happens to if you have a fish that's this big and gets 3 pounds and you have a 10-gallon tank? That's sort of the tank buster effect where a lot of these invasive fish out there might have either been too aggressive with their tank mates, so people thought about tossing them, or they might have gotten too big, and you don't have a home for them anymore, and people release them, which is not a good thing to do. These guys, like I mentioned with the other ones, they eat algae and detritus. So why is that bad if they're eating algae? Don't we want less algae in our environment? Well, they can root around, causing solids to be suspended in the water column, blocking out light, sort of disturbing and sensitive environments on the bottom. But mostly, it's their spawning habit that causes damage to sort of the environment and humans, basically, by our economy. So they like to be substrate spawners, or not substrate spawners, they're burrowers. So they'll burrow on the side of a riverbank, right? You'll see them on like the canal sides, right? And they'll dig a hole, and the male will go into the hole and lock his big uh, pectoral fins in, and they're very hard and armored, like their name suggests. And once they're in that hole and they lay their adhesive eggs in there, and it's like a big gelatinous mass, it's really hard to take them out. So they're great parents in that aspect. They guard them, they make sure they hatch big babies, big eggs, live low on eat low on the food chain, so plenty of food available for them. But when that water drops down and that like sort of water pressure keeping that hole from collapsing drops, that causes shorelines to potentially erode. That costs managers lots of money to fix, gated communities, all sorts of stuff. So, sort of destroying shoreline and banks out there. That's why they would be considered invasive. Like I mentioned, I do aquarium kind of stuff, and this is a bristlenose pleco that I have in my tank. And you can see these weird, like little projections coming off of like its gill plate area, that prevent it from getting pulled out of a hole. So if they're in there, they could really lock in with their big pectoral fins right here that are really rigid, or even these little projections in some species of fish. There's about 6,500 species of catfish out there. Not all of them are sailfin catfish, but shows you the diversity of these animals. So next up, we just have the grab bag. So there's plenty of other non-native fish in our area. There's about 100 to 130 different non-native fish species that have been seen in Florida, with about 30 or 40 of them being established, which is that self-reproducing population. So if one of these gets in one water body, but there's not another one, there's a sighting, but his chances of reproducing are not good if it's just him. But we don't want to move these fish into different areas. That's where they become a real big problem. With some of these species found on the east coast of Florida, but not on the west coast yet. But we're concerned with, kids seeing social media posts, and wanting to get that fishing opportunity here and trying to stock their ponds, which is not good because if something like a snakehead or a really big predator gets in that pond, it could really disrupt the whole environment ecosystem, eat a lot of fish that they like catching anyway, but they might not be thinking of it from the front end. So just more stuff. We talked about Oscars before. This is a jaguar glypode, clown knifefish, bullseye snakehead, Midas cichlid, black acara, a walking catfish here, blue catfish, and hoplo catfish. Those are really common ones, but like I mentioned, there's about 100 different species, or 100 to 140 species spotted that aren't from here in Florida. Whether it's just a one-off, two-off, or a reproducing population, there's about 30 or 40 reproducing ones out there. And most fish are, not that big of a brisk-ish. There's about I think about 10 families of fish are actually ones that cause about 74% of all those non-native fish out there. So how to target them? This is a talk I'm giving to support the roundup that we have going up, and we'll talk more about that and sort of the information that we gathered during the roundup. So use gears based on biology. The mouth size, if it's not a big mouth size, if you're talking about like a little cichlid, you might need to use a small bait like these little split tail grubs or a trout magnet, right? Um, or a small, little fish over here. Look at the dentition, if it's something that eats crustaceans, you could target them that way. Look at the senses, if it's a fish that has barbels, it's definitely going to be something that likes to chemorecept a little bit more, being able to taste things in not very clear environments, right? So you might want a smelly bait if you're targeting like armored cat or walking catfish out there. Like I mentioned, some of those tilapia eat algae, or those sailfin catfish eat algae as well, so they're not going to bite a hook. So you can throw a cast net to catch some of those. There's people that do fly fishing, micro fishing, cast net, bow, gig fishing. If you have an idea or a question on how to catch them, YouTube's your best friend. There's plenty of videos out there of how to catch, Mayan cichlids with a cast net, how to throw one. I like using the combination of live and natural bait sometimes, with tipping it with a little night crawler or a piece of earthworm to be able to, target multiple kind of fish at one time. Look in these disturbed areas versus natural areas. These canal systems are very popular of catching these fish, whether it's the 41 canal, it's 75 canal, gated communities. Ed Maps, which is that I've Got One app, can really help you see where sightings are if you're wanting to target a particular species. Like if you want to see where the piranhas have been spotted, you might be able to find one or two sightings and see a date on when they were reported. Time of year can be a thing too. You can exploit them if they're spawning. Like I mentioned, some of these are substrate spawners where they're guarding their nest. They won't really leave their nest and they'll come back to their nest too. So sometimes you could use a lure to put it right in front of their face and sort of get them to bite, and because of aggression rather than because they're hungry. Caught many a tilapia that way, a blue tilapia that wouldn't eat a hook normally. Water levels, we choose our roundup during the springtime because that's where the lowest water levels are, which allows you to sort of catch these fish like they're fish in a barrel. where a lot of times they might be in the swamp around the cypress trees, but as that water dries up, they're consolidated in these ditches and canals that we could catch them a lot easier. Then polarized sunglasses can really help you determine if that fish is really in there or not. And so you're not allowed to throw a cast net or do anything but really hook and line fishing on game fish species, right? But on non-game fish species, which pretty much considers all invasive species with the non-native species besides the peacock bass, you could throw a cast net on. So that's a way that a lot of people will get our tilapia or our sailfin catfish for our roundup. That's a little QR code for methods of taking freshwater fish, but you could definitely Google that on the FWC website. And one big thing when you're out there fishing is don't introduce non-native species to new environments or waterways. In some conditions, I like to use African jewel cichlids as bait. Throw a little minnow trap as I'm going fishing, but I'll use those fish in that water body and put them on a hook, sort of hook them where they might not survive. But if they're really great bait for peacock bass, maybe Mayan cichlids and stuff out there, but you do not want to transfer or move non-native species to different waterways. So a little bit about our roundup that we have. So this is with the Southwest Florida SISMA, which stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. This is a freshwater fish roundup, so not really targeting lionfish, but we wouldn't turn you down if you brought in a couple. Held in the spring each year. We are targeting fish that were introduced either by the pet trade or the aquarium trade. With some of them being more damaging to the environment than the others. Last year we had over 91 anglers bringing 5,639 fish for 5,400 or for 2,549 pounds, 12 different species, and the largest fish caught was a 6.72 pound tilapia. So all fish that weren't used by anglers as food, used as dissection dummies or teaching tools, or were donated to Naples Compost to be used as an alternative kind of fish product, give life to some trees or potted plants out there. So we'll go over some of the data that I mentioned too, because this is an educational based event. Adults are $10 to enter, kids are free to enter. So we really want to, get everybody out there, share some information about invasive species, have fun while doing it, and collect data for researchers, right? So the data that we collected gets sent to USGS, and they put in their non-indigenous aquatic species database that helps them determine, where these things are occurring. So this is a breakdown of fish that were caught during the roundup. It sort of shows what would either bite a hook or you could catch using fishing gears. However, these blue tilapia are cast netted fish. So Mayan cichlids very popular, blue tilapia, followed by Oscars and then sailfin catfish. There is our flyer, and I'll be sure to include that in our follow-up email that I'll send to registrants after this talk. But it's occurring the last weekend of April. We usually do it the last weekend of April or first weekend of May because it's between Easter and Mother's Day, driest time of the year, great weather usually, and a great time. So our festival event that we have on the 28th is at Bass Pro Shop, and we have plenty of educational opportunities. You could see some of these fish. You could take some of those fish home, actually. It starts virtually on the 26th and ends in that in-person way and at Bass Pro Shop in Fort Myers on the 28th. And if you get the Coastal Angler publication this month, we are actually an article in there on page 34, I guess. So, like I mentioned, this is a data collection event as well. So I wanted to go over some of the cool science that we did in association with this roundup that we have. So a lot of the effort that people put in, we like to make sure it's not in vain and try to get as much cool science out of it. So a lot of folks might be concerned with mercury content in freshwater fish in our area. So we asked FGCU if they would like to do a sample of our fish caught during the roundup to do some mercury content analysis of area specific kind of species that people might target. So this is thanks to the Rumbold lab at FGCU. They were great partners, and I really appreciate them working with us to get this data that could really positively impact folks eating freshwater invasive fish in our area. So we had 110 fishes sampled of 9 different species. This is our sample size of them. Definitely not a huge sample size on species like jewelfish, but not very many folks are eating them. Blue tilapia, pretty common food fish item that folks would target. Same thing with Mayan cichlids, Oscars, all sorts of stuff. So that's our range and length and then weight. So we actually asked people for data on where they caught these fish so we can have better recommendations on where they're located because mercury is actually a land-based contaminant and certain areas will have higher concentrations of mercury just depending on the use of that area, biological processes of like bacteria and algae making it more bioavailable to accumulate in the food chain. So this area-specific data is important and something that you might see in freshwater fish consumption recommendations by the Florida Department of Health that puts those recommendations out there. So we this is our mercury data that we collected, or that the Rumble Lab was so kind to let us use. This level right here, milligrams per kilogram, that 0.3 level is actually what the US EPA sets as a sort of standard criteria for a fish tissue that's safe for human consumption. You can see we're all over the place with some species, but then other species like blue tilapia, spotted tilapia, sailfin catfish are very low, just all across the board, and something I've seen in literature in the past too. So that might be a good fish to consider eating. Mine cichlids were, sort of all over the place, but that might be because our sample size, it's not very huge, but they might have been coming from the east coast of Florida where they have concentrations of really high mercury, or the more eastern side of the Everglades, compared to maybe some other places here that have lower concentrations. But this is, there's a little bit of interpretation to it as well, because if you look at the FDOH, Florida Department of Health, recommendations for freshwater fish consumption or any kind of seafood consumption, they do it on dosages pretty much. So how much do you weigh, how much ppm of mercury, milligrams per kilograms is in that fish, and then how much are you planning on eating, right? So this is actually, I think from the Lee County website that I got, and this is market sampling of fish, so not area specific kind of sampling, although they do have area specific sampling for freshwater bodies, and I'll share that in our follow-up. But then if you look at how much somebody weighs and how much mercury is potentially in that fish, it'll tell you how many meals per week that you should eat. And to just sort of show you, like, red grouper was sampled at 0.373, and that is higher than some of the species of fish that you see over here. So just a little devil's advocate of, you might consider these not safe to eat. Some cases they might not be. Some cases they could be an excellent food item for you. But there's fish out there that people will eat every day and might have similar levels of mercury out there. And usually seafood consumption, the benefits of that outweigh the negative impacts of mercury, unless you're eating it very much or have genetic or the sort of neurological conditions that mercury can affect, or if you're, pregnant or breastfeeding. So oftentimes that fish dinner is better than, another kind of dinner like a burger that we might have out there. So take that with a little grain of salt. So this was information about, sort of area bubbles of higher mercury concentration based on species of fish and how many we took from different areas. So, the South Everglades kind of area is definitely higher in mercury in some aspects. Cool thing we also did was stable isotope analysis. So by looking at the ratios of nitrogen 15, you could see sort of like a blueprint of what these fish have eaten in the trophic level, like what do these fish eat over time? And you can see with this preliminary data that the Mayan cichlids were actually, eating primarily fish, right? And you could see in the previous slide that they had, a little bit elevated levels of mercury compared to some other species. While the blue tilapia was definitely eating more vegetation. And if they're eating more vegetation, they are, they were actually lower and that mercury content over there. So cool data that we're collecting on their life history characteristics that could help make better freshwater fish consumption recommendations in our area. And this year we're going to do a composting study looking how efficacious it is to use tilapia as a compost product, either filleted or unfilleted tilapia. And we might do PFAS, which are another kind of contaminant out there, and see level of PFAS in our area. So what's happening now? There is an increased awareness of the issue. You guys are here listening to me. Thank you for coming. We're doing more research out there. We have new tools like environmental kind of DNA detection devices, new cameras and stuff out there. We're making better inferences of, what an invasive species can do based on what similar kind of animals or plants or something have done with their introduction. So being more proactive than reactive, looking at these big snakes before they are really traded a lot, or other kind of aspects there. So what can you do? You can get involved. You can talk about our roundup. We definitely need the word spread about it a little bit more. You could share our posts. We want to get as many people there to get educated about invasive fish, to get as many of them turned in, to get data from them. And it's a really fun event. I enjoyed, helping host it every year. You can volunteer with FWC, attend trainings. You can do responsible pet ownerships. A lot of these wouldn't be in our environment if people just did the exotic pet amnesty days, where FWC will take a non-native species of animal and find it a home on certain days. There is executive removal. There's an executive order that helps, sort of like protect you from law stuff when you're removing invasive reptiles on areas that you might not even be able to hunt on. You could do that with that executive order with reptiles there. You could think natural, like I mentioned, these natural areas are important to harbor our native species. These disturbed areas are blank canvases for a lot of invaders to take hold, especially since a lot of these come from humans. So if we let it go, definitely the vicinity of that animal is closer to the human population. Like you would find more cane toads around gated communities than you would in the middle of the Everglades. You could educate yourself and others, and yeah, that's about it. So with that, I'll take any questions. I would definitely appreciate greatly if you scan that QR code to take a quick evaluation. My position is based on, whether you guys learned something, whether that, influenced your behavior, either participating in this invasive species event. So if you would take that QR code, scan the QR code, I very much appreciate that. And with that, like I mentioned, I'll take any questions, and I will actually stop recording.